luncheon, this year's Leaders Luncheon, the theme is Progress, Power, and Possibilities. So we're celebrating the centennial anniversary of women's suffrage, recognizing that women of color were not allowed to vote until the passage of the Voting Rights Act nearly 50 years later. And the luncheon will also acknowledge the progress that has been made over the past 100 years. We also look at the power that women and people of color hold today to really shape the possibilities of the next 100 years. So in keeping with this theme and in recognition of Helene's award, throughout our conversation, Helene and I will be discussing what racial justice means today, and we'll talk about the Chicago Community Trust's 10-year strategic plan to close the racial and ethnic wealth gap. I have to let you know that following the conversation, we'll be holding a live Q&A with Helene and encourage you to submit your questions throughout the event using the Q&A function, not the chat, because it will get lost, but we encourage you to definitely stay connected with one another throughout this event in the chat. So with that background, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Helene Gayle.
Hi.
Good afternoon, I guess.
Good afternoon.
It is lunch bites, not breakfast bites, so thank you. Thank you.
It's lunch bite where the speaker can't eat.
I know. This is the world that we are living in. So thank you so much for joining us. And really, you know, I'm actually, not that I'm happy about COVID by any means, but definitely doing this format gives us the time to really get to talk to you and get to know you a little better. And I have to say, as you are selected to be our recipient of the Racial Justice Award, you should know that we don't take these awards lightly. We really look to not only what people do, but fundamentally who they are. And I have to say, from our perspective, for those that don't know you, we hope that they get a chance to know you more today and really see why we believe that you absolutely embody everything that this award was intended to be, and really just speak to how we can all sort of do better as we try to advance racial justice. So with that, I want to get into our conversation a little more. But for those who aren't really familiar with the Trust, let's start by talking about the work that you do and the strategy that you're implementing. And so I mentioned in the opening remarks about your 10-year strategy to close the racial and ethnic wealth gap. So want to hear more about that strategy and how you wanted to focus there.
Yeah, thanks so much. And first, let me say what an honor it is to be receiving this award. You know, I had the opportunity to go to last year's award ceremony, and I was just blown away. And then this year, to be asked to be one of the honorees, I'm like, you know, it really just made me feel just great to be recognized in this way. Hard to imagine, having seen all those incredible people, that I would get this honor. But anyway, thank you so much. And, you know, first let me say a couple words about the Trust overall, because I think a lot of people don't know much about the Trust itself. And, you know, we're one of the oldest community foundations. And as I always say, community foundations are kind of a blend between a traditional foundation and a traditional nonprofit. So we have donors who entrust their resources with us because they want to invest in their community. And then we give out to organizations through grants to be able to further work that makes a difference in our region, the Chicago region. We're one of the oldest. We just celebrated our 105th anniversary, one of the largest. We've been blessed by very generous donors. So, you know, our mission is all about how do we make this a better region. Mm-hmm. When I came in, you know, I was new to Chicago. I was also new to the community foundation world and to the Trust. And, you know, I really wanted to take some time to step back and think about how could we take this incredible organization and perhaps have even more impact. And I came in at a time when that was also what my board asked of us, to really think about how do we do that. And, you know, I'm a doctor by background, public health physician. We could have chosen health. That would have been a very obvious thing. There are a lot of health needs. We have the largest life expectancy gap of any city in America, 30 years life expectancy difference between those who live in downtown in the Loop area compared to many of the Black and brown communities. So health, clearly a big issue. We have the issue of violence. We have the issue of lack of access to education, quality education, et cetera. A lot of challenges. But if you step back and think about, what's underlying those issues, it really is this sustained and growing wealth gap. Mm-hmm. Your wealth, the assets that you own, really in some ways determines your life more than any other single issue. And so we said, if we wanted to make a difference on all of these other issues that in some ways are almost symptomatic of this wealth gap, that let's put our focus on this as our core issue, because we believe that if we are able to demonstrate how you can make a difference on that, it would have a multiplier effect, great leverage. So we said, we would take as our highest priority closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap. And with a very specific focus on racial and ethnic wealth gap, because we know that if you look at any of the statistics, Black and brown communities especially are really the communities that are most impacted by this wealth inequality, and it's for very specific reasons. We know the history of racial housing segregation as an example of discriminatory lending practices, all of these things that are part of a system that has kept people of color out of having economic opportunities. So it's the fact that it is focused on the racial wealth gap is very intentional, because we recognize that it's not just what we do in terms of our dollars, but it's also how do we look at the systems, the policies, the barriers that were put there intentionally to keep some populations from having access to opportunity. That's what we want to attack and focus on. And we believe that doing this in partnership, because it is not going to be the trust alone, we can have an impact on this racial wealth gap and hopefully, make a big difference for our region. And just one final point on that, while, for us, the issue of the wealth gap is an issue of what's the right thing to do for people who have been left behind. Mm-hmm. It's also the smart thing to do economically for our region. We have a region that is 2/3 Black and brown. You can't hold back the potential of 2/3 of your population and expect that we're going to move forward. We're 67 when it comes to growth, 67th of the 100 largest metropolitan areas. We're 67th in terms of our growth. Our growth has slowed for a reason, and it's because we're keeping much of our population from reaching its economic potential. We know that if Black and brown people have the opportunity to earn, to grow assets, contributors to the economy, we can add billions of dollars into our economy and fuel our economic growth.
I love that. And I think it speaks so much to, as we talk about what we're focused on with Leader Luncheon, progress, power, and possibility, clearly this strategy is rooted in understanding the past treatment of Black and brown folks, but also looking forward to the possibilities that, to your point, we haven't, that's why I always argue with people. I'm like, we don't even know the possibilities of this country yet, because we've always been built on keeping a portion of it down. So just imagine. So I love that this strategy is so comprehensive in thinking, not only from where we've come and how we've reestablished sort of how we even think about going forward. So thank you for that. And I also appreciate that it is a 10-year strategy. So that in and of itself recognizes that it ain't gonna be easy. And it's gonna take a little time. So no, I appreciate that. Helene, when you were talking in your opening remarks just about how it was such an honor to receive this, I'm sitting here thinking like, oh my God, like if people knew, I think, the depth of your background, they would have such an appreciation for why it is truly our honor to uplift who you are in the work that you're doing. So I want to go back. I want to go back. You said you're a doctor by background, but just by the way, not any old doctor, that you're a public health doctor, which means you know a lot about a lot of different things and have used that to help a whole lot of people. So I want to go back and I want to hear, because I do think that this strategy that you're talking about with the trust couldn't have been done by anybody. I think you're the right person at the right time to get this done. but I want the people to really understand why I believe that. So let's talk a little bit about your background. So go back as far as you want to, but I really do want to go back and answer the question, who is Helene Gayle and why you and why now? Like, I want to understand that journey that got you to this place to know that this is the right strategy.
Yeah, so, I guess I was going pretty far back. I guess I feel like I'm very much a product of my family and my times. I had a family that valued education, but also felt that we should use our education to give back. So that was deeply rooted in who I grew up to be. I also grew up in a time in this nation in the mid 60s, late 70s, when so much social change was going on. Whether it was the civil rights movement, anti-apartheid movement, women's movement, anti-Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. I got very bit by the social change bug, if you will, because I, as a student was quite active in different social activities. And I really felt that, I got this sense of wanting to be part of something bigger than myself. And so, when I went to school, I kind of thought about what are the ways in which I could develop a profession that would allow me to make a contribution. Medicine seemed like a very practical way of doing that. And so, I pursued medicine, did my training in pediatrics, and then, also started understanding a little bit about public health and realizing that, I could be a traditional doctor and take care of patients, which I was, trained to do. But your patient is an individual and you help one person at a time. And I saw so many children when I was doing pediatrics who came in and out of the health system, not because of their illness per se, but because of broken systems, because of broken both health as well as social systems that led children to not have kind of the holistic needs that they needed to be able to withstand some of the medical challenges. So, I started thinking, I could take care of individuals or I could take care of populations. And really kind of struck on this notion of public health and the power of being able to contribute to populations, whether that's a community, a nation, in some cases even the world, and some of the things I've been involved in. And really, I went to the Centers for Disease Control to do an additional training, thought I would go for 2 years and stayed 20. Because I really did feel like public health expressed that mix for me of using health, which is a very practical, important aspect of people's lives, but to do that at a population level, to do that at a policy level, to be able to actually create change at a larger level than what you can do as an individual. That I landed at CEC just as the HIV epidemic was beginning to unfold. And, initially I did some other things and then ended up spending most of my time focused on HIV, both domestically as well as globally. And I think that for me, HIV was both a very interesting at that time, evolving public health challenge, but it was also so rooted in social issues. So the people who were most vulnerable for HIV were vulnerable because of their social status, because of who they were as people, whether it was injection drug users, gay men, people of color more broadly, and in the international setting, it was often women who were unable, because of social status, to control sexual interactions. And so for me, this kind of interweaving of social issues with a health issue, I think was what really led me and kept me doing work in HIV, and then broadening from there to focusing on global poverty writ large, and as we call these, the social determinants of health. The things are not about what you do in a medical setting, but the things that actually determine your life outcomes, whether it's income, education, access to nutritious food, public safety, et cetera. And so, you know, I kind of went from doing global economic development to now on the same thing at a community level.
No, that's that, and I just so appreciate that because I think that, you know, at least in my mind, so much of what you've done is definitely prepared you for this region in Chicago now, to be able to take on all of our issues, which I believe is just a microcosm of what's happening in the world. And so with that, because as we know, by through COVID and just the civil unrest and what we're experiencing now, you already have this strategy. This strategy preceded all of that. So what in this moment, though, do you think is going to either help accelerate your strategy or hinder it, given where we are, all the things that we're seeing? And I mean, I started with the pandemic and the civil unrest, and I think I'm just going to keep adding to that list because the world just continues to give us more to consider it to be interesting. But what's happening in this moment that's helping or not with the strategy that you all have laid out?
Well, you know, I think help is kind of a bad way to put it, but
Accelerate.
Because all of it, well, I'm just saying I say it's helped as well,
Okay.
but I say that in that, you know, obviously nobody would have wanted a COVID pandemic, nobody wanted a George Floyd murder, et cetera, all the things that I think, to your point, have accelerated. But, you know, I think this disproportionate impact that COVID has had on communities of color has really, in some ways, made clear why we focused on the issues that we focused on. And I don't know how many times people have said to me during this, since COVID, that my goodness, you know, if you had ever predicted, you know, that this would have happened and how much it would highlight why the things you chose were the right things, you know, who could have planned that? And then so I think it really, it solidified in many people's minds why focusing on this wealth gap is so critical. Because the populations that were most hard hit by COVID went in economically fragile, were the most hard hit, and are now really even more economically desperate than before. And then there's obviously the health impact as well. You know, I think George Floyd was in some ways the 1-2 punch. People recognized it, but then I think George Floyd and everything surrounding really added an urgency in people's minds, because I think, you know, again, we focus on racial inequity as kind of the underpinning. And I think a lot of people felt we were past that we, you know, that yes, there was still racism, but it was not firmly entrenched in our society as I think George Floyd, the previous as well as subsequent, all of this pulled together, I think woke people up, and we keep talking about this racial reawakening or reckoning moment where people are saying, you know, for the first time, I'm hearing people talk about systemic racism, not is he or she a racist? Is this an individual behavior? But if this is happening so consistently, this is a pattern, this must be part of a system. And that's what we have to attack, is the system, not individuals. How do we really think about this in a way that really looks at and has a effort that is commensurate with what the actual cause is? So, you know, I think it has added to the urgency. It has added clarity to us about our mission. And, you know, I think it gives us some opportunity at a time when people are looking to how do we reckon with these issues. I hope that what we're doing gives people something to latch on to.
And so in terms of really being able to seize this moment, what do you think you would like to see happening amongst people? Because clearly you all have such a explicit strategy, and we should talk a little more about that. I would love to hear you highlight some of the elements of that, just so people can really get an appreciation for the depth at which this strategy is going. But what else do you see that we should be doing or thinking about, or others outside of yourself, acknowledging that no one of us can do this alone? What else should we be thinking about or seeing in this environment from others?
Well, you know, I think wherever anybody is, they have an opportunity to have an impact on racial equity and, you know, as well as issues related to economic inequity. so I think using whatever instrument, whatever platform, becoming more aware and educated. I think the George Floyd moment, if you will, sent people reading books that they'd never read before, ending the history of racism in ways that people just had not understood before, looking at, how did we get to where we are today, and understanding what were some of the policies that put some of these things in motion. So I do think, I keep saying, the more we know, the more you will figure out how you can use what you have to be able to make a difference, and all of us can. And so I think, this is a moment where aligning our resources in one direction, if you will, towards really figuring out how do we right some of these wrongs, how do we create different systems, how do we create different incentives, whether you're in the business world, the nonprofit world, the philanthropic world. I think we all have our part to play.
No, I appreciate that. So I'll remind the audience that to go ahead and start putting your questions in the Q&A, because we definitely want to leverage this opportunity that we have to hear from such an amazing leader. Not only, literally a global leader in all the ways that you have and continue to influence change around the world. So on that note, Helene, what would you say are some of your biggest accomplishments? I'll ask you two separate questions. One, I want to hear about what you feel from your perspective your biggest accomplishments are, as well as what are some of the major influence to this day in your life and how you choose to do the work that you're doing.
Biggest accomplishment, I'm a weather wimp. I've survived 3 winters in Chicago.
You came from Atlanta, right, to Chicago?
I've spent most of my professional career in Atlanta, although I have to say I grew up in Buffalo, so people always assume that, that cold weather bug stays with you. I'm like, nah. I guess if I were to say, some of the major accomplishments, one thing that we're just kind of coming off of in our final phases is the COVID response fund. Okay. I think that was some of the best work we've been able to do for a variety of reasons. One, we raised almost $35 million and provided a lot of support to people who were just in need of basic food, shelter, cash, etc. So I feel good about what we were able to do, but I also feel good about how we were able to do it. Real collaboration. It was the Trust with the United Way as kind of the lead organization, but we had so many philanthropic organizations, nonprofits, individual donors. This was a true city, region, community effort. And then, of course, we also helped with the statewide COVID fund as well. But I just think those two efforts that showed how organizations could put aside their own organizational identity, not worry about who's getting credit for what, and all chip in a way that made us all able to contribute at a important level. So that's one thing that I would just say very tangibly, we've been able, that I feel really good about. I think there's a lot of other things that in this first year and a half of our strategy, people will hear more about, but there's a lot of ways in which we're working differently with communities, how we're really shifting, even the way we do our grant making and how we get it out and who we engage and all the rest of it. So I think there's a lot that we're doing to not only have a strategy that we feel good about, but a way of doing our work that hopefully brings us more in partnership with community as we do our work.
Oh, that's great. And I have to second that. I have to say that not only being a recipient of the funds as a YWCA, but the way you all did that so quickly allowed us to help people that had immediate needs, that we were able to just get cash out the door pretty quickly to impact those families. So I'd have to agree with that. And you have a long list you could have named. And so, but that is definitely something that at least I could say I was a witness to. So thank you for that. So from an influence side, what's influencing you now? What's driving you to do what you're doing now?
You know, I guess I feel like there's a real moment of opportunity. You know, we're moving from the response fund to actually now launch a fund that's focused on equitable recovery. It's called the Together We Rise Fund. We're going to launch it officially later this week with the mayor, and it will be an opportunity, hopefully, to raise even more dollars. But as importantly, you know, and really focused on the notion of equitable recovery, because if you look at you know, 2008, Black and brown communities never recovered. We don't want it to happen again as we come out of the COVID economic crisis. So, you know, laser focused on the communities most hard hit, looking at issues of jobs and small business development and lending practices, et cetera. And so we will be focused on raising dollars to be able to make grants and perhaps also do some lending. But as importantly, working with corporations in the private sector who can do their practices differently.
Right.
That also help to make a big difference in terms of economic opportunity in disinvested communities. And so, you know, whether it's increasing supplier diversity or, you know, lending practices that are more flexible and doing more through CDFIs that are closer to the communities, or, you know, there's lots of ways in which businesses, you know, whether they contribute money into a fund is not as important as if they shift practices that really, you know, in some ways are count even more than the specific dollars, but how they use their dollars in ways that really help to support disinvested communities. So we're launching that. We, you know, we look forward to hopefully being able to raise dollars, being able to work on business practices, and also continuing to work on the policies that we think can incentivize economic growth in disinvested communities.
No, I love that. As you know, you and I share that same belief that everyone has a set of tools and that we shouldn't excuse anyone, including corporate America, from really leveraging all that's available to them. So can you talk a little bit about, and I'll get to, thank you for folks for getting questions, but I'll get to these questions in a couple minutes. But what I'd love for you, if you could highlight a couple of the key pieces of the strategy that you could share with folks, and I think that may unlock a few more questions and speak to some of the ones that I'm already seeing come through the Q&A.
Yeah, so it's kind of you know, we have kind of three specific work streams. One is how do you increase assets at the household level? Second is how do you catalyze investment in disinvested neighborhoods? And three, how do you lift community voice so that communities are actors in their, you know, in their own residents, are actors in their own determining how things happen within their own neighborhoods.
Sure.
So, you know, we're really focused on, you know, looking at incomes. How do we make sure that people who are either unemployed or employed have access to good jobs, including the jobs that are future jobs, well-paying jobs that provide people a reasonable lifestyle, to growing assets and thinking about things like small businesses, home ownership, other ways in which you kind of turn those dollars into assets. And then three, looking at debt, because we often forget, we think about the plus side, we don't think about the minus side. So think predatory lending, discriminatory fines and fees, et cetera, things that take money from people and give that kind of downward economic spiral. Neighborhood investment, you know, really looking at how do you bring private sector dollars into disinvested neighborhoods. You know, if you look at lending practices, clearly most of the private money goes to wealthy neighborhoods, doesn't get to poor neighborhoods. How do you really work on getting neighborhoods ready to take advantage of dollars as we work on the private side to see why investing in those neighborhoods has a real advantage? So working, you know, kind of tri-sector, really bringing together resources to really drive investment in disinvested neighborhoods, working along with programs like Invest Southwest and other things. And then third is the community resident voice. How do we lift the voice of residents? How do we get residents more able to take action on their own part and actually be able to shift the narrative around our communities in ways that really build on an asset way of thinking versus the deficit way of thinking. So, household, neighborhood, community level is how we're trying to do it.
No, I love that. And I just appreciate that it's so comprehensive in looking at all the different ways and talking about some of the things that aren't necessarily always talked about, like the debt side of the equation, right? There's lots of things that contribute to wealth. And even on the income side, we know that folks may generate income, but may not always retain it. So I think that's such an important strategy. So,
and I'm just going to add to that, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, but for us, we see that we have multiple assets. We have resources and dollars that we can give, but we also have our voice. We also have the ability to shape policy, and in many ways, poor public policy is what got us to where we are today. I think that good public policy also has a huge role to play. So, we are increasingly working on how do you think about policies that can help to shape and increase economic opportunity, whether it's expansion of earned income tax credit, whether it's looking at caps on predatory lending, et cetera. But I think there are a lot of ways in which we want to also drive policies to make a difference, because in some ways, if you can shift public policies, you may have an even bigger impact than what we can have with our dollars.
No, absolutely. 1,000% agree with that. So looking at some of the questions that are on deck, as you first of all, you have a few supporters in being fellow weather wimps. So people always hating on Chicago and the weather. I get it. But so one question that we have is, you've come to Chicago. What's the most what has been most surprising to you as you've really begun this work with Chicago Community Trust?
People always ask me what's most surprising, and I guess maybe I just am not surprised by a lot of things.
Your surprise threshold is pretty high, I guess, right?
I've been around a while, I've seen a lot of things. So I'm not sure that there's anything that surprised me, really. I guess I would say in some ways they're all good surprises. I've been surprised, first of all, at what an incredible collaborative community this is. I don't think any of the 10 or so cities I've lived in that I've ever seen the kind of civic fabric that exists here, where everybody really does want to do something to make their city and their region better. Now, whether or not everybody knows what to do is a different thing, but there is this almost palpable love of this city and a civic community that really engages and works together and tries to make things better. So that was just very rewarding to me. I think if there was anything that surprised me in a somewhat negative way, I guess, it is the disparity. And again, I've lived in a lot of cities. Chicago is larger than most of the cities I've lived in. But the stark contrast does jump out at you. Mm. And that's not to say that there's not a lot of disparity in most urban cities, but it's pretty raw here. And I think that, especially when I first came, I think it really, was challenging to see. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that there is such an appreciation of that in Chicago. And so one of the questions is actually looking at, specifically as you're thinking through the wealth gap strategy, do you think that there's an opportunity to not only look at how families have access to banking early on, including right out of high school, but also looking at fixing the banking infrastructure and seeing if there's ways to support more Black and Latinx owned financial institutions as well, whether they're banks or credit union?
I think there is, and one of the things that I think, when you think about what the private sector can do, everybody could put some portion of their holdings into Black and brown banks. It wouldn't take a lot. People don't have to put everything. If corporations put some portion of their dollars into Black and brown banks, it would be a huge boost for those banks. And we know those are the banks that often serve the needs of their community most. So that's just one example, but I think there's a lot of ways in which we could think about different ways in which banks could be positive actors and really shift a lot of practices that have held communities back.
No, I think that to that point too, it really shows that the need and the interconnectivity of the strategy that you talked about from the household level to the investment level and catalyzing that investment too, and really seeing that's such a good example of that, both of those strategies at play there. Let's see, there's so not that this comment is taken as sort of a naysayer, but there is an acknowledgement that the racial and financial inequity has been around longer than us. But what do we think what do you feel that actually can be realistically accomplished in our lifetime?
I guess it depends on whose lifetime we're talking about. Mine's probably shorter than others, but you know, I do feel that there is a knowledge and acceptance of where we are that I have not seen before. And, you know, I think we all felt a certain, as tragic and difficult as it was, I think seeing people take to the streets, you know, protesting the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, and really saying that, you know, we won't take this any longer. And the fact that it was multi-generational and that it was multi-ethnic, the young, and I guess I get my greatest optimism by seeing this next generation of young people who are growing up in a multicultural, multi-ethnic world, who aren't going to stand for a world that keeps others out, because those others are not others to them. Those are their friends. You know, those people who, you know, they are closest to. And so I think that will shift. And, you know, we know that by, I think it's 2025, under 30, we will be a plurality. We'll be a majority minority. And, you know, 15 years after that, the whole country will be. So I do think the demographic shift does make a difference. So, you know, I think there's a lot we can accomplish as well, but 10-year strategy, because I think it's not going to be overnight. And I think it has to be that blend of programs, but also pushing on policies.
Absolutely.
Get the right policies in place. You know, there's a lot that can be done. As an example, you know, people talk a lot about things like child savings accounts or baby bonds, where money is put into a saving account to a child, and particularly children who come from families, you know, poor families, that by the time they graduate from, get ready to graduate from high school, they will have what is essentially mimicking intergenerational wealth. Well, that's one generation. If we were to pass a bill like that, that is one generation of, you know, totally switching this, where we are today in terms of transfer of intergenerational wealth. And if you get to the age of 18 and you have $50,000 in a savings account, and depending on inflation and whatever, it could be even more, that's something. That's something to go to school with and not come out with big loans, or to start a business, et cetera. So we can start doing things like that, that actually within a generation could really shift things dramatically. I think there are opportunities for real change. That's just one example, but I think there are others that give me hope that perhaps in our lifetime we can see some really big shifts in, you know, in power and in wealth that could make a big difference.
No, I agree. And imagine if we got that parent a good paying job on top of that. So yeah. It just compounds exponentially to be able to do these things. So question specifically is coming through with Chicago Uni Trust. How are you partnering with communities like Waukegan and North Chicago as you look at a regional strategy?
You know, those particular areas are actually covered by one of our sister affiliates.
Oh, okay.
we are really primarily Chicago and Cook County, and then we have geographic affiliates like Lake County. And if I have my geography right, I think that's what he.
Yes, you're right.
I'm still right. But and we have McHenry County, Will County, et cetera. So we have other affiliate community foundations that are covering different parts of kind of the metropolitan geography.
No, that's helpful because I think that there are people understanding how, Chicago is often described as the metropolitan statistical area. So how far does the trust go? So there's a question in here, shout out to others. One of our collaborators, Chicago Urban League, has been helping to increase home ownership in Black community. But what are your thoughts around directly increasing home ownership?
How to do it, or whether to do it, or?
Well, one, I think the question is how to do it, but or what can we do to directly increase home ownership? Yeah.
Well, we're working very closely with people like the Urban League, for instance, on that. So we don't directly we fund organizations who are working on that. And, I think looking at lending practices, big issue, but also looking at financial literacy and financial readiness. A lot of people don't recognize that they can own homes and don't always have the advice that they need or the access. So I think it's both on the the potential homeowner as well as the institutions who provide funds, and also thinking about, are there ways in which there are a lot of different schemes that are looking at rent to own, or really looking at ways in which you can more easily get down, people have access to the credit that they need, et cetera. So we're doing a lot of work on that with people who are very looking at innovative ways to decrease the barrier for home ownership, while we're also looking at lending practices.
Sure. So a question, in terms of your strategy, and as you're looking to reduce the wealth gap, is there a specific target to that reduction? Is there a percentage target, and what does that target look like over the 10-year strategy?
Yeah, we are working on those metrics. That's going to be important. The first thing we're doing is taking a baseline study so that we actually have the wealth, better measure of wealth here in the Chicago region. We're taking part in a study called the Color of Wealth study. It's a national study that looks at, they've got really well worked out metrics. We're also doing a lot of work here in defining more about wealth and wealth status. What are the measures that will be the best to look at? We have some pretty broad 10-year goals of what we want to get to, but we're really in the process now of refining those metrics more.
So on that point, are you seeing, well, a couple things first before I ask that question. I'll ask Christo to put the link to the Chicago Community Trust on their website. The plan is on the website, so if you could put that in the chat, folks want to go right to that. So if we could put a link to that, that would be great. So I think I've answered that question by directing people, but we'll add that to the chat. I know Crystal's running things in the background for us, so she can add the link to your plan, and she did it already. It's like magic. So, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Crystal. So in terms of closing the racial wealth gap, I think, as you already mentioned, that Chicago being a heavily philanthropic place, are you seeing other philanthropic organizations focus on closing the racial wealth gap, or racial inequity in general? Are you seeing more folks focusing there?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of alignment around that. I mean, people are calling it different things. I mean, one clear example is the Chicago Prize that Pritzker Traubert did, that was really focused on disinvested neighborhoods in the South and West Side and looking at economic development. They didn't call it closing the racial wealth gap. It's economic development in disinvested communities, but it's the same thing. And so many of our philanthropic partners are doing things, whether it is funding some of the neighborhood plans, or looking at small business development. We've got a consortium of foundations that are focused on developing small business ecosystem in communities of color so that those businesses actually have the support that they need to be successful as they launch businesses or try to grow their businesses. And that's a consortium of foundations that we're working with. I could, the same with some of our work around neighborhood investment. We're working very closely. So I think this notion, and people may call it different things, but how do we make sure that the neighborhoods and the communities that have been left out of economic growth have those opportunities? And I think, there's a fair number of organizations and a lot of alignment in that direction. I think it, again, is somewhat obvious that, if we keep leaving these neighborhoods behind, these communities, these families, in the end, it doesn't bode well for any of us.
No, thank you for that. There's a couple questions that I'm picking up in the chat as well. One, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, but what can folks do? What I think is interesting is although clearly it's the Chicago Community Trust, but what can we do as individuals to really help our country move forward?
Well, first and foremost, we can vote.
Can I get an amen to that? And I'm going to put that in the chat myself. Yes.
Yeah, I wouldn't, and I'm not telling anybody who to vote for. That's obviously everybody's, that's what voting is about. It's your right. But I think, if we look at the last election and the percentage of people who didn't vote, when you don't vote, you get what you get. And so I think it's so important that people don't, it's easy to be cynical and think that your vote doesn't count, but it does. So, I can't say that enough. I think the census, get counted. We've got just a small window of opportunity to finish that. And it so matters whether or not we get counted, because as everybody knows, that determines where dollars go. And it particularly matters for, some of the communities that we serve, that being able to get the right amount of assistance and dollars in makes a big difference. So I just think exercising one's civic responsibility is so critical. Again, I think all of us have the ability to change hearts and minds by engaging people in discussions around, some of these key issues. And I will say, and maybe this goes back to your question about what surprised me. I felt like I knew a lot about our racial past and racial history here in the United States. Now, granted, I've spent the last 30 years of my career focused a lot globally and nationally, whatever, but it was to actually, and we did a kind of a year-long, almost like study tour of, reading together and talking about issues and having speakers come in and, to understand the complex systems that have been put in place. I didn't know anything about contract buying, for instance, the whole contract buying, which is pretty specific to Chicago. But, this practice that basically took the worst of renting and the worst of home ownership and put it on Black people and stripped more than $4 billion out of Black neighborhoods because of this practice of contract buying. We should know that. Everybody in Chicago should understand why we are where we are today. And, I think that's a grounding that helps people then to think about what's my responsibility in helping to change some of those realities.
So, Helene, we have about 5 minutes left in this. The questions are steady coming, which we expected. But let's do a little personal reflection here. Initially, I have to shout out our board chair, Joyce Winnicky. She asked the question initially about what keeps you up, but further refine that question to say, to really, how do you personally approach the work, given that there's just some, so much of the work is relentless, right? So, how do you escape, stay refreshed, and really maintain your effectiveness as a leader, given all that you have going on and what's at stake? I added that part. Thank you, Joyce.
I guess I feel like, on one hand, I take very seriously what I do, but I don't take myself very seriously. I think you got to keep a sense of humor. You got to keep a sense of balance. It's good to have good friends and good networks and people who keep you grounded and keep you, focused on, what really matters in life. And so, I guess I just, try to stay as grounded and try to stay as close to people who I think, give me perspective.
No, I appreciate that. So I'll get this last question in because actually both on the chat, I see Lisa and Joanne who work closely with the YWCA and actually represent ShyCat too, around this education and using education that ultimately helps close the wealth gap. Where does, as you think about the broader strategy, where does education come in the strategy that you're thinking about with Chicago Community Trust?
We don't have a very large educational strategy specifically. Where we focus on education is really around access to education that will get you to a job. We're focusing a lot on, for instance, community colleges and the pathway to careers, particularly for populations that have been kind of left out of educational access. Education is necessary but not sufficient, and if you look at a lot of the data that show correlate wealth and education and race, race often still trumps education, and we know that education often puts people in further debt, which then makes it more difficult for them to keep what they earn, if you will. So as important as education is, we actually said we wouldn't put a specific focus on education other than kind of education to career pipeline, and not fully appreciating the role that education plays. But we said we would be more proximate to, how do you actually start earning income? True.
No, I get that. And to be fair, I think Lisa's question actually said education and training, which I think you picked up on that, that second part. So no, that's so helpful. So just recognize we have a couple minutes left, and I need to give Crystal her minute to do the last bit of advertising for the YWCA. So I want to say one thing before I ask you a final question, but we're so grateful for your presence here, and I think that you are just such a gift to the Chicagoland, and I hope that what you're doing here will absolutely be a model for how the rest of this country, if not the world, really reconsiders and thinks about how they address these issues that are all based in race and inequity. So with that, let's fast forward 10 years. What does that headline say about what you were able to accomplish?
Chicago Community Trust, in partnership with the Chicago community, was able to decrease the racial wealth gap by 50%.
Whoa, I'm here for that. I'm sticking around for that. Sticking around for that headline because I want to see that. 50%, huge. That's a big number. So, and you know what? And if anybody can do it, I truly believe you will do it. So I just, again, thank you for taking time with us today and sharing your just a tremendous insight with this audience. And we look forward to being able to recognize you further. And I know I'll screw it up, Chris. I should know the date, like I know my birthday and I barely know my birthday. So Crystal, you'll have to remind us of the date of when we can actually hear and see Dr. Gayle receive her award. It's November, the only date of my, November 19th, because right now all I can think about is November 3rd. So I apologize for that. Kind of got the election on the mind, but November 19th is the actual day of the luncheon where we could celebrate Dr. Gayle and her fellow honorees even further. So with that, I say thank you again. Keep up the tremendous work, and we look forward to, of course, being your partner as you continue to just change and get to that 50% racial wealth gap reduction. So with that, I will turn it over to Crystal to show our final screens.